Thank you for joining us today for our Collaborate, Educate, and Participate, Building Collaborative Educational Partnerships with Families to Support Student Growth. I'm really excited today to have Dr. Carla Copeland Joseph, our school psychologist, join me today. We are going to be reviewing some Article 7 eligibility areas, along with special education eligibility versus medical diagnosis, and some components within evaluations to try and help support parents and the school in working together in what that special education process looks like and how we are guided by, driven by Article 7. And so, Dr. Copeland Joseph, thanks for joining us today. We will jump right in and start off by talking about eligibility.
So, of course, eligibility is everything when we talk about special education. In order to actually get to the eligibility stage, we usually have a referral process. And we know that within the school system, teachers can refer students, educational personnel can refer students, parents can also refer students. And once we have gone through that referral process, then we begin to evaluate for any one of these eligibility areas. Some of these eligibility areas also are areas of diagnosis that exist within the medical field as well. So sometimes there is that overlap. But when we are talking about special education eligibility, we are usually trying to identify if a student meets the legal eligibility requirements. For Indiana, it's going to be under Article 7. So we evaluate to find out if that student meets eligibility either under autism, which, as we were saying before, sometimes we have that overlap between a medical diagnosis and special education eligibility. And we'll talk about how those are different. But students can qualify under autism, under blind and low vision, under intellectual disability, deaf and hard of hearing, and I'm sure we can recognize some of these in the medical field as well, right? That we know people who are diagnosed as what we refer to as legally blind or legally deaf. Those exist within the medical field as well. And then we have things like a developmental delay, which has an age cap for that specific eligibility criteria. We have things like emotional disability, language impairment, speech impairment. Then we have categories like multiple disabilities. And when we're looking at multiple disabilities, that's usually when a student meets a number of different special education eligibility categories. And because they have met a number of them, they can be grouped together under the category of multiple disabilities. We have things like other health impairment, which is also a nice broad eligibility category that tends to capture a number of medical diagnoses that are not covered under these 13 eligibilities. So things like ADHD and ADD, even things like diabetes are some of the different medical diagnoses that are covered there. Even things like epilepsy is another very common one that we have as well that can fall under other health impairment, because things like epilepsy, ADHD, etc., they don't have their own category under special education. So other health impairment is a nice umbrella that we can use to capture those students who have those medical diagnoses that need special education supports. We also have other categories like orthopedic impairment, which is affects the motor and movement of the body. We have things like specific learning disability. And specific learning disability is our umbrella category under special education for things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. because those are not special education categories. Those, again, are medical categories, or what we refer to as clinical diagnoses. But under special education, under Article 7, those areas are covered under a specific learning disability. And then lastly, we have a traumatic brain injury. Those are for students who may have had things like gotten in a car accident, and they have had some trauma to the brain that is now impacting and affecting their education. They can fall under that category of traumatic brain injury. So when we're looking at special education eligibility, we are doing so within the confines of the law, as is governed by these 13 areas, and it's usually determined by a case conference committee. So it's not an individual decision, but the team comes together, collects the data, we review the data as a team, and then we propose an eligibility as is based on one of these 13 categories.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So while you were sharing those different eligibilities, you talked quite a bit about diagnosis versus eligibility. So can you dive into that a little deeper for us?
Well, sure. And this is a big one, because, since COVID, we have seen quite a rise in different diagnoses for our youth and our young people, that, of course, is impacting significantly. So a lot of the times, these two can overlap. So yes, sometimes we can see that we have students that have specific diagnoses, and they have their appropriate eligibility, as we were talking about, like, for example, autism, right? Autism has a diagnosis category, and it also falls under special education eligibility. But when someone has a diagnosis, it is different than meeting special education eligibility. So, of course, the first major difference is in the purpose. So when we are talking about special education eligibility, the purpose is to provide educational supports. And of course, when we are talking again about purpose, we are talking about accessing education. So it's accessing education within the educational environment, which is different when we are looking at a diagnosis. A diagnosis is usually for understanding an ailment, for treating an ailment, and eventually for managing that ailment. But within the education system, when a student is found eligible for services, we are looking at meeting the needs of the student within the education environment. Another big difference that we see is who the decision makers are. And we kind of talked about that just a little while ago. When we're talking about the decision makers in the eligibility criteria world, or the special education world, we are looking at a case conference committee. And depending on the eligibility criteria that we are exploring, that committee can look different. But generally, it is going to consist of the parent, right? Parents are always needed. Parents are always welcome because their input is vital. Then their teachers are another big part of who the decision makers are. They're a part of that case conference committee. We have the school psychologist. So myself, I am also involved as a part of that case conference committee. We have the student, who, of course, dependent on age, can have a greater role in the involvement of the evaluation process and in the decision making. Because, of course, when we have teenagers and we are planning for them, we are talking about their needs, we want that student to be present. We want that student participating and being involved because we are planning on their behalf. Sometimes, depending on the eligibility that we're looking at, we would also have a speech and language pathologist involved. We would have an occupational therapist involved as well. And I should say that when we're talking about the teachers that are involved, it's usually special education teachers and general education teachers as well. So it's not just one particular group of persons or one particular group of teachers that are involved in the decision making. But when we're looking at diagnosis, usually the decision for diagnosis, it usually comes down to one person, which is usually the clinician. And sometimes the clinician can be a psychologist, it can be a psychiatrist, it can be a pediatrician, but usually it's one person that is making that diagnosis. So when we're looking at eligibility, it's very team focused, it's very team based, because we want to make sure that we're getting maximum input on that student so that we can make a very holistic decision. And then, of course, another very, very, very significant area when we're looking at diagnosis versus eligibility is the criteria that is being used. So in special education, I'm sure you would hear us say many times that we make reference to Article 7. So we make reference to the law because our special education eligibility is encroached in special education law. So Article 7 lays out specific guidelines or the specific criteria that needs to be met in order for a student to be eligible for services. So it is not based on my opinion of whether I think a student should qualify or not, or, a teacher's opinion. We are really guided very closely to what the law says and the requirements of the law. And that can look very different when we are looking at a diagnosis, because a diagnosis is usually, as we said before, something that is clinical or medically based. And when clinicians are making a diagnosis, they are being guided by a diagnostic manual. So right now we're on the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So that is the DSM, and we're on the DSM 5. And the criteria in the DSM 5 looks different than what the law says for special education eligibility. And we see that the DSM is updated frequently. As I said, they're on the 5th edition. So it's updated much more than special education law is in many states, even in the US as a whole at the federal level. The DSM tends to be updated much more. So the criteria for diagnosis tends to change. It can fluctuate from time to time, which is very different than the eligibility requirements. We also look at differences in categories, which we touched on when we looked at this previously also, that the categories we know for special education eligibility, there are only 13. We can't get any more in there. Just based on the law, we're guided by just the 13. But we know that for the in the world of diagnoses, the DSM manual has, hundreds and hundreds of different categories that students can be found and persons on a whole, because the DSM does not only cover students, which is again different from what special education law governs. Special education law governs students. But diagnoses can govern children and adults as well. So there are hundreds of categories that students can be found to have a diagnosis in, which is different. We're just guided by the 13 eligibility criteria. And lastly, there is no guarantee, right? When we're talking about that difference, because all these differences exist between a diagnosis and an eligibility, There is no guarantee that a student who has a diagnosis would meet special education eligibility. So that's why we can't just say, well, my student has a medical diagnosis of, let's go with autism. It's not automatic that because that student has that medical diagnosis of autism, that they will automatically meet special education eligibility for autism. It still has to go through the entire team, right? It still has to go through the entire case conference, and we have to see that impact, that adverse impact on education. So we do have students who have clinical or medical diagnoses, but it does not adversely impact their education. And as a result, they don't meet that special education eligibility. So we always have to explore when students have their clinical or medical diagnoses and they come within the school system. We always have to explore because the criteria is different, the categories are different, the decision makers are different, right? So in order to meet special education eligibility, we must establish that they meet that eligibility requirement. So there is no guarantee.
And just to clarify with that, Dr. Copeland Joseph, a student may be found eligible for a special education area and not have a medical diagnosis within that area. Is that correct?
That is perfectly correct. Yes. So if we're going to stick with our example of autism, for example, we do have students who do not have an autism medical diagnosis or an autism clinical diagnosis. But within the school system, they have indeed met the eligibility criteria under the autism classification, because based on what Article 7 outlines for meeting the eligibility criteria for autism in special education, they have met those components. And we are seeing that adverse educational impact. So they will meet the eligibility criteria. And then by extension, we will develop the necessary supports to support those students.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that information. Let's talk about, and we kind of discussed that evaluation. In order to establish an eligibility, we have to have a comprehensive evaluation. So talk to us about what that evaluation looks like.
Oh, yes. So as we see listed there, we have all these areas that we look at. But when we're doing that, we really try to zone in on three specific questions that guide us, that really broadens our scope of what happens within that evaluation process. So we want to know, what are my child's needs? What are their strengths? What are they struggling with? What are they excelling with? And then we try to establish the why are they struggling, because some of that helps us to meet their needs. Because if they are struggling and we can figure out like some of the reasons why they're struggling, then we can support them appropriately. And when we are searching for these answers, we are looking in all of these different areas. And again, it depends on what the referral issue is. So we talked about that before, a couple slides ahead, where the referral process determines what we are going to explore, right? But of course, we're going to look at their academic skills, because special education is supports for the education environment. So if these are supports for the education environment, then we must look at their academic skills. So we would, of course, zone in on their reading, their writing, and their math. And then we look at the different areas under each of these. And we're looking for gaps. We're looking for gaps when they are compared to their peers, their same age peers, same grade peers. And of course, we're looking for that educational impact, right? So we want to see if whatever we are exploring if it is having that adverse educational impact. Then, of course, we look at cognition. Cognition is key because when we're talking about cognition, we are talking about the abilities that the student possesses. And for most of our eligibility categories, we have to find out whether the student has the ability to do what we are requiring them to do within the school environment. Speech and language, another very important one, because our speech is so critical in our learning environment. Speech and language is very, very critical within the learning environment. And again, this is a big one that is based on referral. So it's not every single student that we are going to do a speech and language assessment on. But based on the referral, if they're having speech issues, if they're having language issues, for things like autism, the law requires, that is Article 7, special education law, requires that there is speech and language that's involved in that evaluation as well. Social and emotional functioning is also critical as a part of the evaluation, especially if we are looking at something like an evaluation for a student with ADHD, an evaluation for a student with autism. Their social and emotional behavioral functioning is critical. Adaptive skills are critical, right? If a student is struggling with motor, with handwriting, that becomes important as well. So again, things like adaptive skills are not assessed in every evaluation. Motor and sensory skills, not every evaluation. But if the referral indicates that this is needed, it is definitely incorporated as part of the evaluation, because our aim is holistic. Our aim is triangulation. We want data from multiple sources and we want data from multiple assessments. And then, of course, classroom observations, we can't do without those. We want to see what's happening in the classroom, right? So we have to get eyes on so that that data that is collected, that's where our students spend most of their time. So we want to make sure we're collecting data there. Teacher feedback, they're spending the most amount of time with our students, right? Within the classroom, within the school environment. So we definitely want their input. Parent input, huge part of the evaluation. When we're looking at things like behavior, we're looking for consistency across environments. So we want to know what is happening at home. We want to know what parents see at home, right? Parents are usually the experts on their kids. So we want to make sure that we are engaging parents as a part of the evaluation process. And as I said before, student input is critical because depending on the age of the student, they can really give us an insight to what is happening with them, how they feel about certain things. So this student input is a very necessary part. I'm just skimming through my notes because one of the things that I wanted to mention when we were talking about an evaluation is that there are some things that we must understand when we are looking at eligibility and the evaluation process. That, during the evaluation process, we want to make sure that we are looking at data in a very constructive manner. So we want to make sure that when we are looking at the data, that we're looking for things like consistency, we are looking for things like educational impact, we are looking for things like environmental factors that may be impacting this child. So we're not just collecting data for collecting its sake, but that we are collecting data to ensure that it is useful and that it meets the need of the student that we're evaluating.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, as just kind of as a summary and circulating all of that information, we talked about that referral, and that referral can be done by a parent, a school personnel, a teacher. A referral is made, and then the school team reviews that referral and says, yes, we are going to move forward with this evaluation based on the data that we have, and we need to collect new data. Or they may say, no, based on all this information, there's no data to support that evaluation. If, regardless of what that outcome is, the person that has referred the student will be notified within 10 school days of that decision. And then if we are going to move forward with an evaluation, a consent to evaluate is completed, and the parent has to provide consent to test. We can't just evaluate a student without that parent's consent.
Right.
And so once we have that parent consent, we start the actual evaluation process. That is on a 50 school day timeline. So from the day we receive consent, 50 school days, the evaluation will be completed and a case conference held, unless it's an expedited evaluation. And those things are all driven by Article 7 once again. So we complete that evaluation, we sit down and hold that case conference so that we can review the evaluation results, we can review that data, and as a case conference committee, we can determine eligibility. And if we do determine eligibility, we develop an IEP, an individualized education plan for that student. Or the case conference committee may find that that student is ineligible for special education services. And then we look to see how can the school support? Are there needs that the school can do from a Tier 1, Tier 2, general education, 504, other different levels of support, that there may not be a special education eligibility, but there may be some interventions that the student is benefiting from within that school environment. So that kind of went through that whole process. And thank you so much. Do you have anything else you want to share about that?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we have to be very mindful of when we are thinking about special education eligibility is what instruction that student requires. Because when we are thinking about special education eligibility, that's one of the things we have to determine. Does this student needs to be instructed in some specific area? Is this a skill that the student does not have that needs to be taught, whether it's behavioral, math, reading, etc.? Because that is also one of the pillars, the foundational things that we have to establish when we are assessing. So as you were mentioning on that Tier 1, Tier 2, those different levels, that really impacts what skills need to be taught. So that's another thing just for us to hold on to when we are thinking about that evaluation process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just a couple things that I want to highlight, because anytime I have a captive audience and I can share, when a student is identified and we have an annual case review or even an initial evaluation and the student is found not eligible, we always encourage parents to complete the parent survey. You can scan the QR code right here to take you to that parent survey, but this provides great information for the state of Indiana and also for our schools on how we can best support and service our families. Also, just as a reminder, in order to ensure confidentiality, we really want to look at how are we communicating with our special education teachers, special education staff, and especially in our small communities, I encourage parents, you may see somebody at Family Dollar. The special ed teacher may be there, but don't go up and try and process your child's needs at Family Dollar, because that is a breach of confidentiality. And so what we have communicated with our staff, and I want to reiterate with parents, is we encourage communication and we want that open communication, but we want that through school email, school phone, school communication tools. This is different amongst the 3 different districts, whether you use Class Dojo, Remind, Rooms. I did put a note here in your child's backpack with that little exclamation point. Sometimes your child may not always get notes back and forth. So sometimes you might want to follow up with an email of, hey, I sent a note to school today, or something along those lines. Communication that we do not approve of, and we don't want our staff communicating with parents using their personal cell phone, personal text messaging, personal emails, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, or other social media things. And really that is to protect the student and the staff from a confidentiality lens. So just as a reminder for families, please reach out, please communicate with your school, but just make sure that you're using those approved communication tools. As always, you can stay connected by reaching out to me, emailing me. We do have a special education website that this recording will be on, along with a lot of other helpful resources. And as a new director this year, that is something that I have been working on and will continue to work and develop our website to be able to be a place that parents can go and get information. So don't hesitate to follow up with that. And if you have any questions, let me know. This was our first year for CEP parent meeting. And so I have gone ahead and scheduled, save the date, August 14th, 2026 at 12 o'clock. We will be kicking off a new school year and already have some thoughts and discussions that we're going to share with parents at that meeting. So look forward to sharing with families on August 14th. Thanks again so much, Dr. Copeland Joseph, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And parents, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to the school about any of this information.
Thank you.